In this video, we're going to take a look at deformers and how they operate to allow us to change our models in a non-destructive manner. So these can be turned off and they will no longer affect your object, so you don't lose any of the integrity of the model itself. And so first I'm going to add just a simple cube here. We're going to look at some of the basics here. So the first one we have is the bend tool. So one thing that's important about how deformers work is they need to be at an equal hierarchy level to the object that they're going to deform or be subordinated beneath that object. So they either need to be on the same level in the hierarchy or a child of the object they're going to affect. So in this case, I only have one object, so I'm going to just, with the cube selected, hold the shift key as I add a bend deformer, and that will go ahead and subordinate the new bend deformer beneath my cube object. So the bend deformer is placed here, and so in all these cases you're going to have handles for the deformers, and for almost all the deformers. And so if I grab that handle, you'll see I begin to be able to change the look of the cube, and I'm getting a strength and an angle value here. So I'm not getting a great deformation though. It's almost shearing this object in 3D. And that is because of the subdivision level of the object. So if you look here, I've not changed anything. I just have one segment per each side here. So there's not a lot for the deformer to work with. This is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout using deformers, is getting that right subdivision level so that you can create smooth deformations using these tools. So if I come in and begin to increase my values, so maybe I set all these to 10, we're going to start to see the actual smooth blending of this shape. So you can see that here now. And so with this, you can do it here in the Object tab of the deformer, or if you want to interactively kind of experiment, you can use the interactive handle to adjust how the deformation will take place. Within that, you're going to have some different modes. So you're going to have limited, within box, and unlimited. So limited, what that means is depending on the size of the box of the deformer. So if I decrease, let me increase my shape here a little bit so we can see it visually, but then lower it here vertically. So right now the deformation is limited to this part of the shape. It's only bending the area that it encompasses. And what is happening then is the other parts of the object are staying connected to it. So they're being impacted, they are being changed, but they're not actually directly being bent. They are just reacting to the connection that they make with the areas that are being bent. And one thing you'll see here is I start to get this stretching and kind of bracketing this rigid side here. What's happening is it's actually stretching the mesh. It's stretching that area to match the deformer. So if I don't want that to happen, I can use the keep y-axis. And so now you can kind of see it's collapsing on itself at this value. So maybe if I rein this back a little bit, you can kind of see what's going on there. And I might increase this just a little bit so we're not getting that overlap. So if I rotate this now, if I turn that back on, we'll actually get some stretching of the model. So depending on what you're going for, you might want that enabled or disabled. You can always fit your deformer to the parent, and by using the shift key, it automatically does that. Really cool new feature. So that's limited mode. Within box is more rigid. This all controls the fall off of the deformer. So in this case, it's a linear fall off. As soon as it's outside the box, it's not impacted at all. So we get a really hard cutoff when we use this method. lastly, you have unlimited, which means that everything is affected. It doesn't matter where, it matters where the box is, but everything is going to be impacted. And it's just a matter of how this is placed, but everything is going to get bent according to this type of fall off. And again, I could use, set the limit Y size. So you can get some interesting shapes that way, and a lot of these are going to work very similarly. We'll quickly go through a couple more examples of these. So I've got my cube properly subdivided here, and again I can go up here and hold the shift key and add something like a twist deformer. So with the twist deformer selected, again I can play with the settings, a lot of the same options. This is a really cool one to do like drill bits and things like that. If you had a primitive in here, for example, you could really quickly make a really cool looking drill bit out of the twist deformer. And again, all these are animate keyframe able. So if I wanted to animate, this box looking around as a character, you can do all kinds of things with these deformers. Some other ones that are going to run along the same line, the melt, shear, bulge, which is pretty good for doing like breathing in characters when you don't want to have to set that up with some kind of complicated rig. And then you have some special ones like the FFD. Let's look at that. So the FFD works a little bit different. It sets up a grid around your object. Drop it in here. There's that fit to parent. So now it's the exact same size, which makes it difficult to use. Make it a little bit bigger. And so based on the amount of grid points you create, it gives you flexibility to model and change the actual geometry of the model using these control points. So for this to work, you need to go into points mode, and now with points mode selected, I can grab some of these points and they're going to impact a certain reference area within the shape. So the more points you have, the obvious finer controls you have. And this would work across multiple objects. Again, all these deformers will. You just need to have them in the same level hierarchy. So this one is a very handy tool for, being able to take maybe a group of objects and deform them all at once in really intuitive ways. And so unlike the other deformers where it's a little simpler to keyframe animation for the deformers, so as we saw with the bend and twist, it would just be a simple button click for the strength parameter or the angle parameter to animate those. In this case, you have to switch to point level animation. And if you go to point level animation, so I'm going to turn off everything else. Now you'll see you can animate this deformer as well. So again, this is a very powerful tool for allowing you some really good control and to kind of go back and do some real good squash and stretch animation on multiple objects at once and get a really good looking animation out of this. All right, so let's look at some specialized deformers that operate a little bit different than some of these basic throwback deformers that have been around in Cinema 4D for a while. So one we're going to look at is the wrap, and you'll see it here. And so what it gives you is, again, some different kind of values for how it controls the wrap. So again, very keyframeable for animation purposes. And it's a really cool deformer, and you can see here I can kind of move it around and it's going to change what's happening with the model. So you can do some really cool stuff with this deformer. And here I've chosen to use it with MoText because that's oftentimes you see people interested in wrapping text. Again, the importance of subdivision levels is here. So you can see I've switched this to quadrangles with a regular grid value that gives me a little bit better deformation across the surface. And I can do all kinds of different little things with the spline wrap, including extend the Z-scale. The tension value is just going to be how tight. So again, all these can be set as keyframes. So you could have all kinds of animation take place with this deformer. There's also different kinds of wraps. So here's a spherical wrap. And again, if I begin to see my mesh really struggling to match the deformation. So if I render this, I'm looking kind of rough here. So I can go back in and really heighten my caps level. And now we're getting a much smoother deformation of the surface. So there's some other ones that are similar to that. You'll see Spherify is another similar effect. But let's next look at the camera deformer. This is another really special one and a great addition that was made back in R12. So the camera deformer is another one of these different types of deformations that we have. It was a great addition that came out, as I said, in R12. And I've got this simple scene set up with a camera pointed at the left side of the character's face. I've got a subdivision surface with the cube, which is the actual mesh of the character beneath. And when I go to the deformers, I'll see here I've got camera deformer. Drop that in. And so again, it needs to be placed correctly in a hierarchy. In this case, pretty simple. I can just drop it under the cube. Now, right now I don't really have anything for this to do in the object panel. If I go in and tried to work on this right now, so I select a point, I try to move it around, doesn't matter where I click here, I'm not going to get any kind of movement on the mesh, even though it's subordinated below the mesh. It needs to know what camera I'm wanting to use to do this deformation. And you can kind of think about this as the Photoshop liquefy effect. So it's looking to, okay, what plane am I going to use to liquefy this surface? So in this case, I've made this left camera. So with the camera deformer selected, and I go to the object tab, I can drag that left camera into this field. Now I need to look through that camera so I can see how the mesh lines up, and now I can use any of my modeling tools to control the points within this shape. So here, if I go to, let's say, the magnet tool, which is a good one, and I don't really want any points selected here, I just want to be able to control this myself. So I can start controlling the animation, maybe create a little smile for this. And again, right now I'm actually not creating an animation, I'm just doing a still. If I wanted to do an animation, it's similar to the FFD. I'd come in, enable the PLA animation, set a keyframe, come out to wherever I wanted to, then begin to morph the geometry. Maybe a little much. And now, if I record this again, I'm going to have that animation. And so this works on any type of object, and here's the best thing. I don't have to be looking through this camera. It's actually changing the mesh according to this deformer. So if I want to see this from a different angle, I can turn off my left camera, so now I'm looking back at the front. And this deformation still happens. As creepy as it is. So really cool tool. And again, at any time, any of these deformers, they're non-destructive. For any of the deformers, if you want to disable them, just click on the check mark and your mesh restores to its original orientation. Another deformer that people are often interested in when they see Cinema 4D and kind of get into what options they have for creating animations and just cool effects is the explosion effects and explosion deformation. So again, I'm going to select the cube, hold the shift key, and add an explosion deformer. So with the explosion deformer subordinated beneath the cube here, you can see I can animate the strength value. So you can get some cool animation. And right now it's set to have an end size of 0. So what you're seeing is it's going to, as it breaks out, it scales those segments down. If you turn the randomness down, you get kind of a uniform explosion, which of course is as unnatural as anything, but pretty cool for some effects and some kind of motion graphics animation that you could create. So pretty simple. So you would set, a keyframe. This can go negative, so you can get some weird looking stuff that way. But if I wanted to set the strength to 0 and maybe set a keyframe here at frame 70 and then go back to 0, set the strength to 100%, you can have some cool kind of reverse builds. And if I turn this back up to 100% randomness, this will look a little bit more interesting. And if I increase the speed, it'll look even more interesting. So let me break out the speed. That's going to put some distance between the objects, the components of the object and the regular form. And so now these things will come in and build the shape. So you can do some pretty cool stuff that way. The other one, this big brother here, is the explosion effects. And it allows you to kind of create a solidness to your component. So you can see these now look like a game of Tetris. And you have a few controls here. You have time, which kind of dictates the strength that's going to happen, how this is going to play out. And you'll see that you have, in this case, gravity. You have forces. So you can change gravity. It doesn't have to impact the animation. So if I didn't want gravity, I could just set it to 0. In this case, I do want it. You have options for the, set this up so we can see this happening. So you have strength, which is kind of how far things are going to extend out, kind of like your speed. You also have blast speed, which is going to, you'll see gravity begins to pick up on the blast earlier. You have options for variation, so just to get more variety in the explosion. You have thickness, that's, and again, you can add variation to change the thickness of some of your shapes. You can kind of set up the quality of those chunks. So if I turn up the min polys, you're going to get little better control over how these look and quality, that'll also slow down the calculation. And again, you can just add a lot of stuff to this. And you can even add some little extra bonuses in here. So all these are keyframeable, and you can make some really interesting animations with this. Main difference being you add a little bit of in the way of forces to this kind of explosion, and you have chunks. So you don't just have the planes extending out from the surface. Next up, we're going to look at the spline wrap. So the spline wrap you'll see right below the surface deformer. And so how this works, let me kind of set the scene for you. So I have a spline path that I've created, and I've got an arrow here. Let me take this off. So here's an arrow that I've built, and I want the arrow to do a few different iterations of wrapping around this spline path that I've created. So what you'll see is I'm just using extrude. I like to keep myself totally flexible, so I've not made this editable at this point, and as I begin to do the spline wrap, I'll be able to see how I can adjust the settings of the extrusion to match up to the amount of subdivision levels I need for this spline path to work, spline wrap to work the way I want it to. So what I'm going to do is I've just grouped this together, because remember, a deformer only needs to be at the same level in the hierarchy. It doesn't actually have to be subordinated below an object, just needs to be equal. And that also allows you to use it on multiple objects at once. Anything in that grouping will work with the deformer. So without any further ado, I'm going to click on the single arrow group and hold the shift key as I add the deformer, as again that will subordinate it underneath the single arrow group. So now with the spline wrap added, you'll see right now there's nothing going on. I'm going to change out of my set camera so we can kind of see what happens as we step through this. So right now there's nothing going on. If I look at the spline wrap, it asks me for the actual spline that I want to do the wrap on. So as soon as I drag my spline path in there, we're going to start to see some deformation. And this is not really what we were going for. Okay, so it's trying to wrap this arrow around this spline path. It's trying to fit it to the path. And although sometimes you may want something like that, right now it just wouldn't work. We don't have enough subdivision levels within this model for that to work. So there's a couple things we can do. Plus, even if I were to change the mode, so if you look down here, here's the mode, fit to spline. If I say keep length, it's going to snap this in, but you'll notice that it's not going to go the way I want it to. So if I pull that around, I don't want that pointing to the left, I want it pointing straight ahead. So in the spline wrap, I'm going to set this back to fit spline for a moment. If I change the axis, this will be plus Z. I can see by the alignment of my arrow here, I want that to be plus Z. And so again, now it even looks a little funkier. But from here, I can start adding subdivisions. So within the extrusion itself, I can go to caps and change the type from n-gons to quadrangles, and then change that to regular grid. And you'll start to see it's trying to make that geometry look better. So I could even lower this way down. I could say width of 1 centimeter, and that's going to really increase the subdivision level. So it's starting again to look a little bit better, still not there yet. Within the spline itself, right now the intermediate points are set to adaptive. If I were to set that to uniform, now I'm starting to get something, okay? So still, if I rendered this, it's going to look blocky here. So don't want that. So if I come in here, let's set this to 100. Now we're getting a smooth deformation that fits to the spline. So if you're doing Frozone or Iceman or something, you can make a really sweet path that way. This is not only awesome for motion graphics, but it's awesome for modeling. This is one of my go-to tools for helping me model all kinds of sophisticated shapes. So what other controls do we have within the Spline Wrap for this type of option? So if I wanted to make this animate along this path, I can come in here and use some of these settings here. So I have strength, which is going to take it from the object to the path. Not very attractive here. I have offset. Now this one will be handy from time to time. And you'll also see I have from and to. So for example, if I pull the to back around, you can see I can control that animation. So I could set a keyframe at 0 and a keyframe at 60 at 100. And we're going to get that animated wrapping around. So lots of options there. There's also offset. So if I'm going to set this back to 100. So if I set the offset, you can see I can shift this in different ways as well. Kind of control the flow, so if I don't want it to take up the entire spline path. And of course I could also use the from option as well. And then from there, now if I controlled it with the offset or with the to setting, you can just get some interesting flip arounds. All right? So that's fitting it to path. Now, if I don't want to do that, I can go back to the Spline Wrap and say, you know what? I do not want to use the fit spline. I want to use the keep the length. I want to keep the length of my arrow. So here it is. And so now if I go to the Spline Wrap, I could animate this, moving along the path. So again, I could totally animate that. Oops, use the offset, sorry about that. So I could use the offset to animate that object around. I was actually squashing my object there. So if I, again, I could set a keyframe at 0, amount, set a keyframe at 100%, and then we would have just this single arrow, moving around along this path. Again, another cool option. Let's say we wanted to make a bunch of these, though. A bunch of these arrows come around and make this path, a common motion graphics type animation. So I'm going to hide this one. I've already built this out, and I'll explain it a little bit. So here's a cloner. Same thing, same spline wrap. Keep length, because I don't want to stretch out the clones. And then in the cloner, I've just created, say, take this down to just 1 so we can kind of see how this looks. And with a separation of 150, which gives just a little bit of space between each added clone. And so you'll notice I've not set this to PY because I don't want it to stack vertically. I want it to stack along the same direction that my arrow would be going along the path. So if I turn all these on and increase this number, you'll see that now it's actually increasing them along this path. So you can do some really cool stuff with the Spline Wrap. It works, again, just has to be equal or subordinated beneath an object to work, just like the other deformers. And this easiest way to animate this would be to use this count within the cloner. So it's just a linear cloner set out to a minus Z of 150. And if I set this at 0 and then came out to maybe frame 60, I forgot what the number was, maybe 26. May take a second for it to catch up, but here we'll see that animate around. Apparently it wasn't 26. Can't be much more. Let's see, 29. So now I can animate that, and we've got that path coming through. I still have those controls for offset, so I could roll these out, and you'll notice they will extend beyond the spline path if I roll that all the way back. So you could do some really cool stuff with the Spline Wrap Deformer, and that's again one of my favorites to use for both modeling and animation. All right, we're going to look at a couple more deformations. For this one, I'm going to just add another shape here, add a little bit of variety. So I'm going to add a sphere. I'm going to pull it up. May want this cube to be a little bit bigger. And so let's say I wanted to basically wrap a shape to this object. To actually both of these shapes as one shape. So first of all, I need to connect them real quick. So the best option for that is to use the connect object. Drag both these in here. And then now I'm going to add, let's just say, a plane and pull it up. And now I want this to fit over this surface. And so again, holding the shift key, adding a shrink wrap deformer will place this in the right hierarchy, and we can see how this effect looks. So right now it's placed correctly, but we have no effect because we need to place a target object into the target object field. So I'm going to take this connect object, drop it in here, and now you'll see that it takes from the original position of my plane and tries to pull and wrap that to the surface, and in this case of both these objects. So this will look a little bit more interesting if I pull my plane down, and we'll start to see that shrink wrap occurring. And I can even excuse me, I'm not trying to hide that one. I can even hide the connect object. I didn't like that actually. So let me pull it up a little bit more. And so what you have is, again, issues with the segments. So if I turn up these segments, we're going to get a smoother deformation across the surface. Same thing for our objects that are being shaped. And within the shrink wrap, you have strength, so you can, again, animate this happening over time. You can change where it wraps from, and you can adjust distance, which in this case wouldn't do much for us. But again, it's just kind of another cool deformer that you can use, a little bit different than some of the others. And that's the shrink wrap. And let's look at one more. This is a new deformer in Cinema 4D. Great tool. It's the bevel deformer. So the bevel deformer, as you can see here, begins to create a beveled edge. This is a huge answer to a lot of modeling issues that come up once you've made these objects editable and you want to go back and add a bevel. Sometimes it can just be a little bit cumbersome to go and do that along the surfaces, and now we can do it with just adding a deformer. So you have different options for how this can work. The shaping of it by default is round. You'll see under options that we can set how large or small the bevel is, and then also determine the subdivision of that. So how smooth do we want that bevel to be? We can only do certain edges, which is very cool. We can also, again, use different types. So if we had a spline shape that we wanted to use as the bevel, we could add that in. And again, this is totally keyframeable, so I could come in and animate any of these settings. But the main thing is it's just a fantastic tool for modeling. And depth, another thing that we can adjust. So you can get all kinds of different looks with this tool, and just a great addition to Cinema 4D's Deformers. So in this video we've looked at the Deformers, kind of an overview of the different Deformers and how they work. And so the big takeaways are subdivision level of the objects you want to deform, and also the hierarchy necessary for Deformers to work on objects.